Hi everybody. In part 1 of The Secret to British Politics, I made the case that one can only properly understand and be sensibly involved with British politics if they begin with the knowledge that our modern political system is a renaissance of Anglo-Saxon kingship. To do this, I used the reign of Alfred the Great as an example, demonstrating the equivalence between the king and council and prime minister and cabinet, as well as showing how modern political delegation of national, county and district politics descends from this time. Finally, I also wanted to show that even oft-derided concepts like cabinet collective responsibility have continued to exist because they are essential to good government. In short then, that the basic concept of Anglo-Saxon kingship is actually a very good form of government, and hence why England, and then the UK, have continued to fall back on its ideas. In parts 2 and 3 of this series, I want to move into the medieval period to suggest that this was an era of political testing and experimentation, a tussle between competing Anglo-Saxon, Roman and feudal ideas. Specifically, we'll look at how the particular form of the English and then British Parliament, amongst a few other things, develops from this great era of political testing. There is a tension inherent to the Anglo-Saxon model of king and council, and I think it has two fundamental origins. The first is the inevitable dissonance that occurs when councillors have to hold two sets of opinions at the same time. And the second is that the council invariably contains those people who are rivals to the leadership, likely why the idea of hereditary monarchy was created, to protect against usurpation. In Alfred the Great's time, this meant the other noble families, or the ealdormen, and today it means the other top politicians. This model of government can work very well when the sense of national interest is strong, as it was when Wessex was on the verge of annihilation by the Vikings. But the Norman invasion replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite, itself not averse to a bash-up, with a far more fractious and disunited Norman aristocracy. It is this fractious and jostling political situation that the tradition of Parliament, as a body foremost meant to oppose government, or the king, arises. The Parliament of the medieval era thus becomes a struggle between two visions. The first is the Anglo-Saxon concept, which I referenced Edward I understood in my video Zombies, Tyrants and Edward I, in which Parliament is a body to help and improve government. The second vision is the aristocratic or parliamentarian vision, that Parliament is there to subdue government and, frankly, protect the interests of the parliamentarians. The model of Parliament that the UK has today, therefore, is formed by this battle between whether Parliament is a place for the high idea of good national government or the body through which the elites jostle for power. Whilst the specific form of Parliament doesn't literally have a direct link back to the Anglo-Saxon Council, it is because of the latter's legacy that it takes its unique form. This is because whenever the king or the aristocracy wanted to outmaneuver their foes, they invariably appealed to the English as a nation based upon national government. We saw, for example, in my other video, that this is exactly what Edward de Montfort did when he formed his parliaments. Because it is important to remember that the rest of medieval Europe developed parliaments too, but they invariably succumbed to either absolute monarchs or simply dissolved out of pure uselessness. One important factor in this was the feudal state of continental politics. In such societies, nobles were mini-kings in and of themselves, with political structures heavily, if not entirely, privatised. And in these circumstances, parliaments were more senatorial, where each noble simply had their say purely as a class, rather than an effective body of state government. The English word for this would be a talking shop, and right up until today European parliaments take this same basic form via proportional representation. They are now simply talking shops of the entire population, rather than one elite class. This feudal and therefore lack of national voice meant that there was never this pressure on continental parliaments to be models of national government, rather than a place for aristocrats to talk about their own personal power and ideas. This is quite clearly in contrast to the oppositional form of modern English and British Parliament, and it is in contrast to what happened in medieval England, because despite their continental and feudal heritage, the Normans were well aware of England's specific constitutional arrangements under the Anglo-Saxon kings. William I, the Conqueror, embarked upon what can only be described as a brutal military occupation of England. But it was his son, Henry I, who came to the throne promising to annul the bad government of his father and brother, who was king prior. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle demonstrates the conscious and sophisticated political meaning of this, registering it as Henry's promise to rule the English as they had before the Norman conquest, in other words, as an Anglo-Saxon or English king. You might even call this Henry's manifesto, because this was more than the usual oath that kings took. And indeed, after his coronation, Henry issued a written version of this known as the Coronation Charter or Charter of Liberties. In effect, the charter therefore bound the king by laws, and thus, only one generation after the autocratic rule of William I and his son William Rufus, Henry I re-injected the idea that a king was not absolute, but one part of a wider and legally binding political system. This style of peaceful foreign takeover itself actually had a precedent already, in the form of the Viking King of England Canute, who reissued the earlier Anglo-Saxon charter of King Edgar. Because England was rather uniquely a nation-state, it meant that foreign rulers realised that if they simply agreed to rule the English as they wanted by their own laws, then the English didn't really mind that much that they were foreign. It was a win-win situation, and it is probably very important to understanding the mindset of the English and perhaps now the British today as regards immigration and international politics. You can see its effects in the English inviting William of Orange over to accept the crown, but only on the basis that he'd rule as an English king by native traditions, laws and customs. And unless by some fluke, I would wager that the first non-white Prime Minister the UK will have is very likely to come from the right or conservative side, precisely because what matters is values rather than ethnicity, or indeed any identity, which is why the only two female Prime Ministers of the UK have both come from this side. I think I only have to put the proposition of either Rishi Sunak versus Sadiq Khan or Priti Patel versus Diane Abbott to broadly demonstrate this point that value and ability matter and not race. And also, let's not forget that the Turkish descendant and privately educated Boris Johnson was given his majority by the white working people of the North on exactly this basis. Our Parliament's direct origins are in Magna Carta, the settlement that brought King John back into legal line and gave the aristocrats an official legal power, effectively making them an institution of their own. And at the core of Magna Carta was this tension between the council, the aristocrats, who felt that John was not acting in the ancient English tradition, albeit with their own self-interest in mind. They argued that he had broken the sacred unity of monarch and council and was ruling tyrannically, which is why they felt so confident that they could make their radical constitutional settlement, which allowed them to conduct war against the king. This is thus a period of English politics trying to resolve the problems created by the Norman conquest and to work out a new settlement and what new institutions of state are for, and in particular what Parliament is for. It is a period where English nationalism is having a strong effect upon the squabbles between the Norman elite's feudal rivalries, always bringing some of that aristocracy to consider the Anglo-Saxon style of monarchy worth it for its stability and national support. This is why Parliament begins to crystallise in its modern form when it is a useful body used to help legitimise kingship. By this, I don't mean the monarch or monarchy itself, whose legitimacy rested upon the hereditary principle, but more the actions of the monarchy as legitimate. Parliament therefore helped kingship, or as we would now say government, to operate effectively by creating a national interest. In practice, and in particular, this meant that it protected that fundamental English right of private property by requiring the king to call Parliament to raise new taxes. As a side note, and not that I would want to stress this too far, but it isn't a million miles away from the Athenian democracy, in which property created a shared national interest and rights as well. But Parliament also did something else that helped relieve that tension I spoke about in the Anglo-Saxon model. We saw in part 1 that the Kingdom of Wessex was a very efficient political system, with delegated, decentralised power and politics. Nonetheless, it still suffered from the fact that those involved with central government, those of the council, were always acting as state figures and never just themselves, because their positions as, say, ealdormen, were state and political positions. This made it very hard for anybody to be critical of the king or government without destroying the outward image of unity or collective responsibility, as we say today. The specific form of medieval parliament, however, having evolved out of conflict, became a place where the aristocracy, or as they were now called, members of parliament, could publicly question the king and government without breaching the entirely necessary unity of government. To use a modern term of very different meaning, you might even call it a safe space for debate. And actually, this concept exists today because parliamentarians have increased freedom of speech within Parliament precisely so that debate is not stifled. I hope that I've been able to give a flavour of the idea that central to English and thus British politics is the idea of empirical experiment, that history itself has helped to shape the political structure and battle test it against different situations. This is a cornerstone of the idea of political renaissance. And I also hope that I've been able to demonstrate how this looks in practice, because the impact of this history remains with us in the various arguments of our day. The mistake, though, would be to seek to emulate these medieval positions, rather than studying them as a process and accepting the very real and conclusive results that these medieval people quite literally suffered and died to discover. Of course, every single body or institution that is set up immediately gains a level of self-awareness and self-interest, and there have always been parliamentarians and parliaments who would tell you that de Montfort and the Rump parliamentarians were brilliant, and that their job is to counter the power of the king, of the government, rather than be part of the wider political system as I have started to describe. In the third and final part of this series, we're going to look at why Parliament ultimately must take this Anglo-Saxon or Edward I form if it is to survive, because it is in this form that it is a useful body. We're also going to see how, funnily enough, it is our modern form of government that is much more similar and much more suited to acting in the same vein as the Anglo-Saxon form of government than the medieval period England was itself.